What's up everyone? Lance Hedrick here, and today I'm gonna blow your mind. Today we're going to be talking about a new scientific breakthrough by the same people who brought us turbo shots, video linked there, just a few years ago. And this one is talking about the Ross droplet technique. Essentially, it's taking this phenomenon that began at the home that has been shared on forums for a long time of the act spritzing your whole bean coffee with a little bit of water in order to mitigate the static forces at play during grinding. Chris Hendon decided to take upon himself and see what's actually going on when you spritz your whole bean coffee with a wee bit of water. Now, I promise you this is going to be much more simple than I'm making it out to be, because I am here to hold your hand as Professor Hedrick to walk you down the paths of academia without being scared of the ivory towers and the little gargoyles sitting atop looking down at you and making you all spooked out. I've been reading this paper, I've been testing the claims in the paper, and I've been discussing with Hendon himself on the implications as well as pushing back on some of the methodology. So let's buckle up and read this little abstract. It is hard to imagine that less than a century ago, what we now understand as the espresso did not exist. The drinks made in cafes and at home instead resembled something like those produced with a mocha. What is this? This isn't the article. Oh, it's because it's Standart Magazine, and that's the article yours truly wrote in a recent edition. Now, Standart Magazine is sponsoring today's video and is an awesome addition to your daily coffee workflow. Incredible little stories in there. I mean, good grief. They also have beautiful people in here. It's like a centerfold covering. Look at these levers that are definitely not mine. Lance Hedrick takes us through the history and development of the home espresso machine, from the first patents all the way to PID controllers. Wow, they get incredible authors for this. So I know you're super intrigued by Standart Magazine because, I mean, I read it, I write for it. I've been interviewed for some of the previous ones on WDT, on things like that. It's kind of cool, don't worry about it. Clicking my link below, you will receive a free issue and the coffee that accompanies it, because every time you get an issue, you get a little sample of coffee, which is really cool. Now, it's $9 US for global shipping, so you will have to pay that, but everything else is free. Now, this comes only in subscription format, which is $89 US annually. So check out that code down below, www.standartmag.com/Lance. No, not Lance Hedrick, so you don't have to misspell my last name, you crazy people. Anyway, let's continue by reading the actual abstract of the paper and not my glorious little article. Moisture-controlled Tribo electrification during coffee grinding. Yeah, you may want to sit down for this one. This video is going to have some far-reaching effects on how you prepare espresso at home and will greatly elucidate some of the mechanics of espresso extraction that otherwise might have been a little difficult for you to understand. Maybe you were flying blindly by the seat of your pants, whatever it is. I think there are some really intriguing things in this paper and what I'm about to present that is going to really help you understand what you're doing when you're dialing in, and can improve, actually greatly improve, with the simple addition of water, your brewing situation. So I'll start by reading this abstract so we can get an idea of what this paper is about, and I'll break down the following segments of what I think is necessary for you to kind of understand. I'll also present my methodology in testing some of these claims, and we'll see what kind of stands up in the end and how this can affect you as a home brewer. Now, if you want to skip around to the different sections, I do have robust time cues below in order to help you if you want to come back to it, because some of it was difficult to follow. But again, my goal, my love is to teach. And so I really want to ensure that I'm getting across to you all of the main points in this paper without it being super confusing and without you needing to go and read this chunk of sliced paper. So gather around, children, and we will read an intriguing story about Tribo electrification during coffee grinding. Abstract, sentence 1. Granular materials accumulate surface charges through Tribo electrification and Fracto electrification. These processes occur during coffee grinding. The coffee medium serves as an ideal platform to study the fundamental aspects of electrical charging, while also having implications for brewing coffee at both the end user and industrial length scale. By sourcing commercially roasted coffee, as well as roasting our own, we find that roast, color, and grind coarseness impact the charging. Fine, darker roasts acquire charge-to-mass ratios comparable to those inferred from particles in volcanic plumes and thunderclouds. Furthermore, we elucidate with the influence of residual internal moisture on electrification, concluding that moisture can tune both the magnitude and polarity of charge. In addition to possible technological applications, we demonstrate that the addition of external water simultaneously suppresses surface charging and clumping of ground coffee, and results in notably different flow dynamics in espresso formats, likely yielding markedly different taste profiles. All right, so what the heck does that mean? First, let's break down some words. Tribo electrification and fracto electrification. Tribo electrification is referring to the buildup of electricity or static in this situation based off of friction. So something rubbing against something else. That's tribo electrification. Fracto electrification is studying the electricity or the static electricity in this situation of when something fractures. So at the point of fracture of something, so in this case, a coffee bean, when it fractures, there's intense heat that builds up and is released, and there's a static charge that occurs there. So it's looking at these two different places where static electricity can be created. So what this paper is doing is looking at the effects of static in ground coffee and looking at whether there are ways to minimize or reduce or take away that static, and looking at what static does in the coffee itself, what particles are charged at what polarity, what they do to the extraction, whether or not it affects extraction, and whether or not we can increase or decrease bed permeability based off of this static charge. You heard the abstract, you're still like, what is this trying to demonstrate? We demonstrate that 1, conventional coffee parameters, which would be roast, internal water content, grind setting, dictate the charging of roasted coffee, and they offer an explanation why, and we'll take a look at that. Both triboelectric and fractoelectric processes occur during grinding, with the majority of charging coming from fracturing events. That's their contention. And 3, charging depends on the coffee bean's internal and external water content, with higher water content suppressing charge accumulation. They're trying to prove that triboelectrification does not matter as much as fractoelectrification. If we remember those terms, that means rubbing, then the static produced from rubbing does not matter as much as the static produced from fracturing, or it's not as big of a impact. They're trying to show that internal and external water content prior to grinding has a big impact on the static of the resulting dose of coffee, and they talk about roast level and internal water content having an effect on what that following static will be. So they did this experiment using a Faraday cup, and they were using an electric meter to see what the charge was of these whole beans going down. And then they were further understanding how electrification was occurring during this process by measuring the ground output of the EK43 they used in this experiment. One of the goals was to see which particles had typical charges, if that was the case, and what trends there might have been between the coffees they used, which was a plethora, and what the net charge would be post grinding. What they concluded through this testing is they saw a weak correlation between roast level and the net charge post grinding. They saw essentially sub 70 agtron readings. So agtron, this is a gourmet scale that is essentially measuring the darkness or lightness of a coffee from 0 to 150, 0 being carbonified coffee, so just black, and then 150 being green coffee. Oftentimes specialty coffee sits between, they say 40 and 90, but there's much higher. You have Nordic roasters that go up to about 120 on the agtron scale, but that's just kind of an idea of what we're working with here. But they saw that sub 70 agtron, so quite dark, that's going to be like you buy Lavazza off the shelf. Sub 70 agtron, they saw a weak correlation between that darkness and a net negative charge. But what they noticed was a stronger correlation was the internal water moisture content post roast and the net particle charge. So they contend that over 2% internal water content of the roasted bean has a bigger effect on that final net charge than the agtron does. So they noticed that over 2% internal water content was consistently giving them a positive charge of those final grounds. Now, what do I mean by this net charge? So essentially, some grounds during that fracturing and the tribo electrification, some are going to be charged negatively, some positively, and whichever one has the greater force in the end, that's the net charge, right? So you're going to have charges of both in that final sample, and this is going to cause some of the grounds to stick to other grounds, forming aggregates. So essentially what they were seeing is under 100 microns, they pretty consistently saw high negative readings. So those tiny particles tended to read negatively. And then the big boulders, those things over 300, 400, 500 microns, those tended to read negative as well. It was that middle section, again, we're speaking speaking of espresso settings, of 100 to 300 microns that regardless of roast profile and Agtron, they tended to read overall positive. Now the biggest difference between these net negative and net positive charges between these Agtrons would be the abundance of those boulders and those fines. So obviously if you had a lot of boulders, a lot of those small fines that outweighed that middle section, you were going to have a net negative charge. If that middle section outweighed those other ends, those extremes, you were going to have a positive. And it tended to be lighter coffees and higher water content that had those. Now, they refer to the Agtron one as a weak correlation, but they do contend that that is a factor, and they look at that water content as a stronger possibility. Now, this is an interesting observation already, because this is probably telling us that lighter coffees, based off of just the charging, are going to give you a bit more uniform grind size. Now, that is speculation. They don't say that in this paper, but that's what it would seem like to me. If that middle section is kind of dictating that overall charge for the positive ones, it has to have more of those in order to have that overall positive charge, because the bigger boulders and the smaller ones were negative, regardless of the roast profile or the water content. Those tended to be negative. You would have to have a lot more of that middle section in order to have a net positive charge. The higher the net positive charge, likely the better that particle distribution. So if there is that type of situation where the lighter you go or the higher water moisture content you go, the more that center section, that 100 to 300 microns, grows in volume, it seems that that might also correlate with a more uniform grind distribution. That's me speculating. I just think it's an interesting thing to note as we continue to go through this. The primary consequence of electrification is the formation of aggregates. So as I was saying earlier, since we have those tiny particles being negative, those big boulders being negative, and those in between being kind of like negative positive, you're going to have some of these grounds stick together because of those opposite charges. Opposites attract. So we have negatives, we have positives, and they'll come together and form aggregates. Now, these aggregates are affecting the bed density, they argue. Because these aggregates are there, it is causing essentially heterogeneous layering of those grounds. Now, if we could separate those aggregates, in a perfect world, we separate those aggregates and we lay the bed evenly, we can get a more homogeneous extraction that would have a higher bed density and less permeability, arguably giving more homogeneous contact between the water and those grounds. So they're looking at, okay, how can we get these charges to go away and hopefully stop the aggregation, so deaggregate the situation and allow for a more homogeneous extraction. And that's where water kind of comes in. During this study, they noticed that there were parallels to other fields of science. For instance, in the fracturing events during a volcanic plume, the larger particles tend to also be negatively charged. They noticed that, and they were able to kind of borrow some from those volcanic studies and found a lot of similarities. Now, we won't get into that here because I don't think that directly affects you at home, but I think that is an interesting parallel that they made. Now, as we're talking about this, before we go to how they tried to mitigate the static that is created during grinding, I think it's interesting to talk about this internal water content. For those that don't know, green coffee, what we get when it's shipped to roasters from importers or from the farm, what we get are these green beans that have a relatively high internal water moisture content. Now, it's an agricultural product, there's water inside of it, yada, yada, yada. A lot of times this tends to range between 12% and 8% internal water content. Typically, roasters try to stay between this 8 and 12% area. If you go higher than 12%, then in storage you could grow some bacteria. If it goes below 8, you're going to have negative effects on the cup. And of course, this is going to change from origin to origin. It's very important to maintain that higher water content in your green in order to produce really nicely tasting coffees. There are some interesting techniques now of rehydrating your green coffee if it gets really low, which could be really interesting. There seems to be some exciting studies that I've heard about where people are intentionally dehydrating their green because it stores much better at low concentrations, around 2% or so, and then rehydrating prior to roasting. So that has nothing to do with this video. I just thought it was an interesting thing to note as we're talking about internal water content. But the reason I'm talking about it now is in this paper, they noticed there was not much correlation, if any, in the green internal moisture content and the static charge of that final coffee. It more so dealt on how the coffee was roasted for the final internal water content in that roasted coffee. So as coffee sits and it's losing moisture, that's going to greatly affect what's going on. The way they tested this was by roasting their own coffee in-house and testing it 24 hours after roasting. So they had a pretty good idea of what their moisture content was, and it wasn't changing much. Now, if you had a coffee whose internal moisture was 2.5%, but that was the case 8 weeks ago, and over time it's losing some of that content, content, even though it may still be over 2%, you might not get the same conclusions they have here. Now, I say that because I did some testing and I was presenting it to Dr. Hendon, and it seems that one of the speculations he had is potentially coffees that have aged, even if they're over 2%, it may not have the same effect as fresh 2%. And that's because some of the chemical changes that occur in coffee over time. I did test some of these theories that 2% and above is consistently giving positive charges. Now, he gave pushback on my methodology, and I checked with some electrical engineers, and it seems that no one really knows for sure whether or not the way I tested this is 100% accurate, but I thought I would still throw this out there to you all, because I'm sure there are engineers watching this video that can, either confirm or deny what I did. But this is not to deny what they did. It is more so to give a potential second opinion, because this whole study is based on a single grinder, which I think is a massive downfall of the study. I think this could have been a lot more robust if they would have checked multiple grinders. And I'll go into why a little later, but essentially they used an EK43, which in my tests, in my studies with dozens and dozens and dozens of grinders, is the most efficient with regard to throughput as well as efficiency. So you're going to have a pretty skewed experience using an EK43 than if you were to use something else. The mashing in an EK43 is on a much lower level than something like a cone burr or even a smaller flat burr that has a fast feed rate into that initial pre-breaker and then is mashing to get out of the finishing teeth. So it's going to cause a lot more Tribo electrification than something like the EK would. But anyway, my test, what I did, I took a typical voltage meter, so something that's measuring kilovolts, and I was measuring the grounds as they exited 3 different grinders. I dialed them all to the same espresso recipe. I took the same coffee that was 1 week off roast, over 2% internal moisture content, and I ground on these 3 separate grinders at the same dial for espresso. The 3 grinders I had were a compact PK100, a niche zero grinder, and then one that I am not at liberty to disclose. Just ground them all, and then I measured the grounds coming out of the chute with this electrostatic meter and in the cup afterwards. And what I got was a net positive, a net neutral, and a net negative from the 3. So this is measuring in kilovolts though, and they measured in coulombs. He was saying you can have a negative voltage charge and a positive coulomb and vice versa. He was arguing they are mutually exclusive. I reached out to 2 electrical engineers. Neither one of them were sure that was the case, but didn't want to really comment on it because it wasn't their area of expertise. So maybe someone out there can settle this, but it seemed to me one was at -2 kilovolts, one was at 0, one was at +1 kilovolts, all with the same coffee, over 2% internal moisture content. So I'm not sure, based off of that and the researching I've done, I'm not sure that you can, say all grinders, all coffees at that 2% and above is going to consistently give you positively charged, because I had the same coffee and I had 3 different charges, which is probably showing that there's more than just fracto electrical charges at play inside the grinder that are playing a heavy part. So I think Tribo electrification is doing a lot more than is really shown in this paper because they used an EK43. And let me take a quick sip of coffee. Something that isn't thought about often is the rate of mashing that goes on in grinding. So something like the EK43, massive burrs, 98 millimeters, and also has an auger that acts slightly as a pre-breaker. If someone at home wants to take one of the burrs out, put coffee through, you're going to see that it breaks the beans up pretty nicely because how quickly that auger is moving at 1760 RPM. So you have a pre-breaker, and then you have these massive burrs that can help spread out the coffee so it has a quick throughput, meaning it touches the beginning of the burr and gets out incredibly quickly. They even note in this with high-speed videography that they were able to see the initial grounds coming out tended to be more of the bolder-sized coffee grounds. And this would make sense because at the beginning, those first ones going through are not being met with resistance from other grounds trying to get through, causing longer contact time with the burr. The longer that dose is going through the burr, the smaller and smaller those particles are necessarily going to get until the very end when they're kind of feeding really slowly, doing the popcorning. Obviously, you can test this very easily at home by taking a dose, dumping it in your grinder, all of it at once, and checking the grind, pulling a shot. Then do another one and slow feed it 1 bean at a time. tick, and you're going to notice a much coarser grind size and a much faster shot. So obviously that contact time in the burr is a very important factor that should not be left out. The EK, as I said before, is the most efficient I have seen out of any grinder. Yes, you have the Zerno and the Bentwood with augers that are pre-breakers, but they have much smaller burrs. This one has 98mm burrs and has that auger feeding it. So what you're getting is a much more efficient system of grounds touching the burr and exiting very, very quickly all over that burr face. Not only that, but at the end, it goes straight through the chute without having to go through any tunnels. It doesn't have any sweepers since it's not a horizontally mounted burr. There's no more extra rubbing going on. So it's minimal in heat creation based off of Tribo electrification and least off of static generation due to Tribo electrification. So whereas I do probably agree with their findings that Tribo doesn't matter that much in an EK43, that's not necessarily the case in other grinders like the PK100 or a P100, which are horizontally mounted, rely on sweepers, and you dose it all at once without a feeding mechanism, meaning there's going to be more congestion in the grounds, causing more mashing. The more it mashes, the more that Tribo electrification comes to play, the more heating those grounds are going to experience, the more heat damage, the more static, etc., etc., etc. So you're going to have a much different experience with that, as well as the exit from it out of the chute, because it has to use those sweeper arms. It's sitting there. Some of those grounds are in there for a while, just rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and going around and around and around on these different types of anodized aluminum or plastic in some or whatever that surface is. All of those are going to contribute to that rubbing, which is going to affect the resulting grounds. But then we look at cone burrs, even less efficient. Those mash horribly and have some of the worst heat damage that you can have because it has an incredibly fast feed rate with those spikes on top, just sucking beans down. It's creating that torque to break it, and then it's running down to those finishing teeth, and it's taking a while. If you watch the exit of grounds from a cone burr, it's just spraying out very slowly in comparison to like a flat burr grinder. So you're getting even more Tribo electrification there. And especially if it has to build up in those sides as sweepers on the spinning burr is ejecting it like on the niche, then you're going to have a lot more Tribo occurring. I think that this needs to be redone with multiple grinders of multiple different mashing rates and a lot of different surface materials where those grounds are experiencing that charge from rubbing exiting the grinder. Now, continuing through the paper, another thing they noted is the finer something is ground, the more charge is accumulated, which again goes off of that mashing discussion we just had. The more it's sitting there and mashing, the more the charge is going to occur, the more contact time with the burrs, etc., etc., etc. And they proved this with a lot of coffees and different grind settings. Essentially, the coarser you go, the less net charge, the finer you go, the more net charge. So I think this further adds to my argument earlier that something that has less efficient crushing and mashing is going to produce a slightly different charge that could potentially change how this is all being interpreted. But during this testing where they were looking at this finer and finer grind setting and they were looking at how it affected charging, they also noticed something that I think is really, is great because they were using particle size distribution using a Master Sizer 2000. What they noticed was darker coffees at the same setting as these lighter coffees were producing particles 100 microns smaller on average. So let's just put numbers on this. Let's say you're on a 2 on an EK43 or you're on a setting 15 on a niche 0. If you put light roast in, it would give you a particle peak at, let's say, 170 microns, okay? If you use that same grind setting with a much darker coffee, that particle peak could shift down to 70 microns. So I know that we have noticed this before. We've noticed it when dialing in coffees that we need to go a lot coarser for darker coffees. We know that. And I've always chalked that up to just it being more brittle, and so there are more fines, which is true, but it's also shifting the peak particle. Now, what do I mean by peak particle? I've said that in the video and I'll say it more later in the video, but what I mean by that is essentially that average particle size. If you were to take an average of if we are looking at all of this sample size and we're like, all right, but what's the average particle size? That's that peak particle size. So it shifts greatly finer. It skews a lot finer. They had to do setting 1 for lighter roasted coffees and setting 1.3 on an EK43, so 3 ticks coarser to match the particle size distributions between dark and light in order to measure the static. There was a little difference in static, but nothing that but it was much closer, I should say, percentage-wise to those lights in order to have a more constant comparison between the light and the dark. Now, they don't really give a great explanation as to why it's grinding so much more finely. I think that arguably what's going on is there's a lot less density in darker roasted coffees, and so whenever you're grinding, there is a little bit of slop in the threads with all these Burr sets, some more so than others. But essentially, whenever burrs are experiencing grinding, and this is why the Burr touch, the marker method, is not super efficient, but whenever beans are fed in, those burrs do go out a bit. And so more dense coffees can potentially push them out a bit more than darker roasted coffees because they're more brittle, less dense, they have less power, less strength to push out. Those lighter roasted ones, as they're fed in, could potentially push it out a little more. It's very difficult to assess the alignment of a hand grinder, for instance, based off of Burr rub and Burr lock, because essentially it's based on one thin little axle, and as you're grinding coffee and the grounds are filling the pathways, it is going to help self-align that cone burr as long as the tolerances are solid and as long as everything is kind of put in place. So essentially, when those beans are feeding through, there is some slop in the thread, and it's going to expand the burrs just a smidgen. And so darker roasted coffees could be producing smaller particles because it's not giving as much resistance to the burrs as more dense coffees can do. Now, again, I don't have proof for this as far as speculating as to why they notice this on particle size distribution, but that to me makes the most sense and is consistent with what I've seen in other areas. All this to say, this explains why with darker roasted coffees at a constant grind setting, we see reduced bed permeability, slower shots essentially. It's because they are grinding a more fine peak particle. So it's finer. That's literally why it's going more slowly. If you go from light to dark, same grind setting, it's going to be a much slower shot. So what are you going to do? Could also be due to solubility, don't get me wrong, but it's not proven that it's because of solubility based off of this. What this proves is that it's truly just a lot finer overall with the same grind setting. It's just producing finer grounds. Now, as they continued their study, they wanted to see which force had more prominence, essentially, a Tribo electrification or Fracto electrification. So that's rubbing versus fracturing. So the way that they tested this was with a pretty unique experiment where they took an EK43, they ground coffee at setting 2, so pretty like right around espresso, a little like a coarse espresso, a turbo shot. They ground it through and they measured the static charge based off of that. Then, essentially, as coffee sits there, the static dissipates super quickly. It can dissipate with light roasted coffees in a mere 10 to 15 seconds. Darker roasted coffees may hold on to that static a little longer, up to a minute or so. But anyway, what they see is after they put it through, they measure the charge. What they did is they put the grind setting to 6 and they put the grounds through it again. Now, why setting 6? That seems super arbitrary. It's a coarser setting like a fine V60 or so. Why setting 6? It's because they found if they put grounds through that after it's already been ground, that the particle size distribution measured on that Master Sizer 2000 laser did not change very much. So they were able to get as close as possible so there is as much rubbing as possible without actually changing the particle size distribution, which is showing that there's not much more fracturing going on. So they can essentially measure the effect of Tribo electrical forces. And they noticed that there was barely any change in the neutral static experience of those grounds. It didn't really increase very much in the static that was imparted on the grounds in that second regrind, and they did this on multiple coffees. So based off of that, they feel somewhat confident in saying that Fracto electrification is much more important in the grinding process than Tribo electrification. Now, I push back on this obviously because of what I talked about earlier with the differences in grinders and the differences in Tribo electrification, the differences in mashing, and the fact of the matter is when it's going through and not experiencing that cutting, you're also not experiencing a lot of that buildup that occurs where the grounds are stuck and they're sitting there rubbing each other. There will be some, but because it doesn't have to sit there and crack and crack and crack and mash and mash and mash, there's a lot less rubbing going on. So you're not able to get an identical replication of the original grinding, which is going to give you a lot of Tribo electrification. So whereas I do probably agree that that is showing us the majority of what's going on is fracture events, I don't necessarily think it rules out a priori the massive effect Tribo electrification does have on the static properties of the coffee. Now let's get into how they were able to mitigate static. So of course, one of the things that a lot of people recognize is humidity. It can affect the static of a grinder. Some people have grinders and they're like, oh, this doesn't produce like any static for me, but they're living, somewhere with 80 or 90% room humidity. Some people are like, oh, this is so staticky, and if they're living in a really dry climate, 30% or so. They noticed in their testing that ambient humidity does begin to affect the static properties of coffee at around 60% room humidity. So they were doing their testing between like 20 and 45%, so that wasn't having an effect, but they did specifically test this, and at 60, and as you continue to go up in humidity, it was affecting the static of the coffee. Not necessarily fixing everything, but there was a noticeable difference in the static, a lessening of static in those higher humid contexts. So when I did my testing, I made sure that my studio was below 50. So I have a big dehumidifier in here, and I would make sure it was constantly below 50 while doing any of my experiments. I've seen a lot of speculation as to why someone might be experiencing more static than others, even though neither one of them are adding any water or anything. That might be the reason why. They were able to kind of take that into account, and I'm glad that they had the foresight to test that, because I think that is an important thing to know and an important thing for us to kind of understand. Now, welcome all of you lame people that decided to skip here. No, I understand it. Just go back at some point, listen to it when you're in the car, driving, whatever. All of that I said before had a lot of juicy tidbits in it. But I know people are skipping to here because this is the Ross droplet technique section. This is the crux of the paper, the most exciting part of the paper. I understand you're wanting to skip here. Obviously, one of their big things they wanted to do was to measure the effects of adding water systematically to coffee beans in order to measure the effects on the grounds. And just skipping to the big thing, with enough water, they did notice something pretty incredible. The aggregates that are formed in coffee grinding from those polar charges and coming together and causing issues in bed permeability and density, they noticed a decrease in aggregation. They noticed an actual deaggregation of these boulders and fines that have clung together. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean they literally took particle size analysis of dry doses. They looked at what the peak particle was, they looked at the boulders, the fines, all of that good stuff, and then as they were spritzing water, they continually measured the particle size distribution. With increasing levels of water addition, external water addition prior to grinding, they noticed deaggregation. So they noticed a shift in the particle peak to the left, meaning that the peak particle size has lessened, which is showing us that some of those particles that were reading much bigger have now been pulled apart, so they can read a smaller particle and an even smaller particle on that particle size distribution chart. So they saw a shift to the left on the peak. And additionally, not just that, because laser is not the best way to measure distribution. On top of that, they noticed something peculiar. When brewing espresso, they noticed prolonged espresso extractions and higher extraction yields on the same dose, on the same coffee, on the same grind size, same everything. So it increased up to 50% the extraction time, and increased quite a bit in their experiments, around 8.3 TDS to 8.9 TDS with a 45 gram yield. That is a massive difference, and they're chalking it up to this deaggregation. Because you're able to separate those boulders and fines, or some of those bigger particles from smaller particles, you're able to get a more dense bed, you're able to level it out more evenly, and have less bed permeability, arguably giving you a more homogeneous path for water through the grounds. So obviously I had to put this to the test. Obviously, duh. I decided I was going to use what I think is my most consistent setup. I started by using a grinder I've been testing lately, the Coffetech Monolith Flat Max with 98mm burrs in it. And I was using the Unica Pro with their default espresso setting, which I have found to be insanely consistent, which is essentially it ramps up at a higher flow rate to 9 bar and then switches to 2 milliliters a second for the duration of the shot. I was pulling shots. Then I would add 10 microliters per gram of water. Pulling shots, recording, then 20, then 40 microliters, then 60, right? So anyway, I was introducing more and more water. In this paper, they talk about doing in increments of 5 microliters, 10 microliters, 15, and 20 per gram. Now, what are those measurements? Literally, it's just saying per gram of coffee, you're using 5 microliters of water. Per gram of coffee, you're doing 10 microliters, et cetera, et cetera. So to make math easy, I just did 20 gram doses for everything. So that means 20 microliters per 20 gram dose is 0.4 milliliters or 0.4 grams of water. So you can do the math for the rest of them. It's very simple mathematics. But essentially, that's the addition of water. 0.4 milliliters is a ton of water. That's almost half a gram of water added to your dose. No one's doing that much at home. But they were seeing the most effects in this paper at 20 microliters per gram, which is almost half a gram of water. So that's quite a bit. But anyway, I tested all of it to see how it was going. With my Monolith Max, I didn't get identical numbers to what they were getting because, again, Monolith Max, it's more horizontally mounted. There's no feeding system. It's the same burr size, but it doesn't have that addition of the pre-breaker, and there is those little arms that is sweeping it out. So anyway, I was getting similar numbers to what they were getting, and it was shocking me. I was getting 50% extra extraction times. I was getting a little higher extraction yield, and I was like, wow, this is really working. This is very similar to what they were getting on their tests, except I was using, I think, a bit more stable extraction protocol. I was seeing at 5 microliters, 10 microliters, I was getting clean grounds coming out, but it wasn't really affecting the extraction yield, and that kind of goes along with what they were seeing. But then last night, I started to think, wait up. I'm making this argument for all this mashing causing great changes to their previous results. And, I'm pushing back on, you should have used more grinders. You should have used more grinders. You should have called Burrman. And yet I didn't think to be Burrman when I was testing the extraction. What am I doing? What I did is I took the niche grinder. Of course, I have to take the niche because so many people have the niche. And it's known for mashing the mesh out of grinders, okay? So I took the niche and I decided I'm gonna put this through its paces. And I pulled like 60 shots last night from 10 p.m. to literally 5:30 in the morning. When dry, I was getting roughly, 20.8 to 21% extraction yield at about 37 seconds, but that's using a certain pre-infusion. Don't worry about the time. You're gonna be like, that's a really long shot. No, it's not, don't worry about it. And then I added 10 microliters per gram. And this is where it wasn't affecting the EK43 or the Coffetech very much, if at all, okay? And this is where I noticed a massive bump. My times stayed roughly the same, but my extraction increased by about 0.8%. It went from 8.37, 8.35 TDS to about 8.6, 8.7 TDS, and a 28.8 or so extraction to about a 21.6, 21.7 extraction. And I was like, that's weird. The effects are occurring at a much lower water dosage with something like the niche than with the Coffetech. So then I went to 20 microliters per gram, which is what was the biggest difference on the Coffetech and on the EK. And it actually dipped a little bit. The extraction time increased from 10 microliters, but the extraction yield decreased a bit. The times went up to about 41 seconds, but the extraction dipped back down to about 21.3, 21.4. So it was a longer extraction than 10 microliters, but had less extraction. Very interesting. And then I went up to 40 microliters per gram just to see, okay, let's just keep adding water. And this was the wildest thing of all. Not only did extraction dip a bit more, it went back down essentially to where it was at dry doses, a little bit higher than the dry doses, but it started to dip quite a bit. It went down to right at 21% extraction yield. But the most interesting thing is all of these other shots maintained 9 bar, even though I had it on a flow profile essentially. It maintained 9 bar the whole way. It didn't dip. It would hit that 2 mils a second at the maximum, and it didn't dip at all, maintained 9 bar for all these. But when I got to 40 microliters per gram, my shots increased to 9 bar, and after maybe 8 seconds, 7 seconds at 8 bar, it started to decrease. The puck was eroding rapidly. And I cannot explain this. It's very weird to me. Very, very weird. And it's something that I told Hendon about, and he was like curious. And I had repetitions. I did multiple, I did 3 to 5 of each shot. And this messed with me so much. I got it consistently, 3 shots in a row. Messed with me. I was like, I wonder if after all this time my grind has drifted, which I did check multiple times throughout my testing using a dry dose to see if I could replicate the original numbers. Not only did it not drift to being a more loose grind setting, but after I did those 3 in a row where they measured that same, they had that quick disintegration, I did a final dry check, and my next shot pulled just like the original shots. In fact, it pulled like a second slower and a little bit higher extraction. It was at 21.02% at 36 seconds. And the original ones were, about the same time actually. So I actually had a little bit of an increase from the original shots. So it was not just loosely flowing because I was pulling so many shots. So it was very interesting to me that the pressure dipped at that 40 microliters. Now this is not to say that happens on the EK or the Coffetech or other 98 mil burrs or even any other flat burrs, but it did happen with this niche. which I think is interesting because it shows us that these numbers cannot be taken from the EK and placed on all different grinders. So essentially, even though 20 microliters is where they found really nice results, that may not be the case for you. And it's going to be really hard for you to know, unless you have a refractometer, that you're objectively improving your extraction. Because as I said, they noticed a correlation between longer extraction times and higher TDS. But as I showed, at 10 microliters, I had the same extraction time as no water added, but consistently higher extraction yields. At 20 microliters, I had longer contact times, but lower extraction yields than the 10 microliters. So it's not essentially a one-size-fits-all. It's something you're going to have to test in order to really be able to understand. And obviously, all of this is for not if it's not tasting better. That's the number one thing. Their goal with this is to make and improve extraction efficiency. And so this, they have found, is an improved efficiency if you're doing the right amount of water. So all of this revolves around you doing the right amount of water. There is a shift left on the peak. I actually have an independent friend who measured with their imaging unit, and they sent me the data, and it looked very similar, but I was able to guess which two had the Ross droplet technique because there was a shift to the left. So I think there is a shift going to the left due to the addition of water, but unless you have these fancy tools, you're strictly going off palate, which is absolutely fine. That's what we taste coffee with. But it's not as simple as saying, let's replicate this amount of water and we're going to get the same results. Because as I showed with my niche, it's not going to do that. It's not going to do it with the DF64 because it has a fast feed rate, but really small burrs in comparison to 98 with no auger to pre-break anything. So it's overloading the finishing teeth, causing a lot more mashing, which is more Tribo electrification, more heating, more crazy stuff going on, right? There is a flaw I did discover also in their testing and in my own testing that needed to be addressed, and I told Hendon about this. They're using a dose cup like this, and they're adding water with a pipette, which is very accurate. But after you shake it, whatever you're doing, let's say that they shake it to evenly disperse the water. I'm not sure how they were doing that, but let's say they shake it. Some water is going to be stuck on your hand, so there's a little water left. You dump it into the grinder. Water droplets accumulate on this because there is that kind of rough finishing. It's because it's not hydrophobic. So they dump it in the grinder, some water's left here. They grind it, and you can see water specks inside where you fed the beans at, so some water's left in there. And then I'm sure there's a little bit of water left elsewhere inside the grinder itself. So how do we know we're being consistent with all of our measuring? This is where the big issue for me arose. The consistency tended to be a little less accurate when I was adding doses of water. Dry doses, I was like boom, 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 37.6 seconds, 37.1 second, 36.9 second, whatever it was. There were bigger gaps whenever I was doing water addition. That's because you can't guarantee the amount of water on the dose itself. Now that doesn't help when it's in the grinder itself. We don't know what's going to stick in there. And what I can tell you is when I was working with the niche, which doesn't have as high of RPM, it's not creating as much it's not as efficient when it's bringing the beans in, and it's not as wide of a feeding area. There's that little feeding disc. There's a lot of areas where water can accumulate before it gets to the burrs and is distributed inside the grounds themselves. It's even more peculiar that 10 microliters had the greatest effect because I guarantee you less water was in the beans before making it to the burrs than on the EK at 10 microliters because of that feeding disc and what it has to go through in order to reach that final area. As I was going more and more water, and I would go to do a check shot with dry, I would notice that water was still inside the chamber, was affecting my dry grounds, and was causing longer shots. So then I would have to run 2 or 3 doses of just dry beans through it to get rid of any residual water in order to keep testing. The way I was able to see this, when I was grinding with dry dose and it was coming out, some of the grounds were sticking to the side, caking to the side as if there was moisture there, even though I would wipe with a dry towel everything between every single dose, regardless of the amount of water I was using. I was wiping everything down with dry towels to make sure everything was perfectly dry. So I would get some caking grounds, but on top of that, I was also getting more grams out than I was putting in consistently with the dry doses, which never happens for me on the niche. I have to measure a bit more than 20 grams. But after I was doing a lot of water ones, I could measure 20 or even 19.9 grams and get out 20.2 or so, which could obviously refer to the retention. But let me tell you, after each one, I was banging that lid, and I was able to get most everything out. If you had a pipette and you were adding it there and you had a way to make sure it wasn't going through the grinder itself, it's probably a more accurate way of adding water to the coffee beans themselves. I did notice condensation on that plastic lid of the niche, meaning as it was going, the relative humidity of that area was increasing throughout my grinding and sitting situation, which could cause corrosion inside the grinder itself. So you're also at fear of that if you're adding a ton of water. Now, I don't know, I wasn't super paying attention, so I don't know if this was happening due to the small doses of water, or if it only happened when I went up to 40 microliters, which is a ton of water. That is 0.8 milliliters, almost a full gram of water added to your dose. So it could have been just because I used that much out of curiosity, and it could be completely fine with the lower amounts. But in the end, I'm not telling you to use water, to not use water, but what I am saying is absolutely, with my testing, backing up their testing, adding water to whatever degree your grinder needs and your coffee needs based off of its specific static charge due to its specific forces inside the grinder, there is going to be an increase in extraction, an increase in the density of the bed, and a decrease in the bed permeability, which is going to give you a more efficient extraction by just squirting your beans with a little bit of water. And you're going to extract a lot more. Hopefully I extracted more knowledge when I did that for my dome. Just because the particle distribution shows a slight shift left, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a direct correlation between that and the slower flow through the coffee bed. It doesn't really make sense to me that deaggregation of these tiny particles is going to cause that much more bed density. What if it's just because the grounds are wet? Could wet grounds just cause a little bit more puck pressure, a little bit more resistance, and it causes a longer shot, and that longer shot is what's creating more extraction? So what I did, because I had to test this, is I got a little atomizer. This dispenses about 25 microliters per second, okay? Feels nice. I took a Teflon baking sheet and I spread the grounds out and I added just the right amount. And so it was actually more than what these grounds are probably getting in there, because I was adding the same amount, but you got to take into account the water that sticks to the dosing cup, et cetera, et cetera. And I tried different amounts, and it was never changing the extraction time. It was always the same and the same extraction yield, which is very intriguing to me. So then what I tried is I took my Cafetech Monolith Max, I dialed it in to 250 RPM. And the reason I did it that low is I wanted the ground stream to come out really slowly. And I sat there, and for 20 seconds, I hit those grounds, baby, as they came out. And I measured the resulting weight of the grounds, and I was able to get the same amount of added water to the grounds to ensure that I was getting them sufficiently wet. I tried that many times of angling down, of angling up at the chute, of angling everywhere, making it just rain this little stream of atomized water. Anyway, it wasn't affecting the shot times. So that theory was kind of dead in the water, I guess. I just felt like I needed to bring that up because some of you may have been asking the same thing. What if it's just wet grounds? What if that's just raising or decreasing the permeability because it's giving more resistance due to it being pre-wetted? Well, I tried it. What about ionizers? What about just letting the coffee dissipate as it's static? Does this affect the extraction? Can I get the same thing without potentially harming my grinder? The answer is no, sadly. Now, you're saying, well, why? I'm reducing static. Static's going. Yes, static dissipates quickly. I could grind coffee right now, and I could show you as it sits here, the static dissipates very quickly with lighter coffees. And so then you put it in, and there's no static. And static is why the issues are arising. Yes and no. Static is arguably the reason these issues are occurring with these aggregates forming. But what you're failing to recognize, if this is your pushback argument, is ionizers or sitting and letting this happen is happening after the grinding has occurred. So yes, an ionizer, plasma generator, whatever you're using, a corona emitter, whatever it is that you are using in order to neutralize the grounds, are only neutralizing the charged particles. All right, and that's not even talking about tuning it in from coffee to coffee, because it's going to vary depending on a lot of different things. We're not even talking about that. Let's say in a perfect world, it neutralizes everything charged. So we put that Acaia ion beam right there. We do whatever it is in order to negate the static as it's leaving the chute. The issue here is, again, it's only neutralizing charged elements. The issue that we have seen with extraction is due to the aggregates formation. Okay? So because the aggregates are forming due to the static contributed during the grinding process, whether Fracto or Tribo or a combination of both, because of that, they're falling out and the aggregates are already formed. The aggregates are already neutral. That's how they're forming. The positive and the negative are coming together and forming a net neutral particle. So that ionizer isn't recognizing it as something to break apart and to neutralize. It can't do anything to the aggregates because they're already roughly neutral. So yes, you'll get a cleaner grind with an ionizer. Yes, you'll get a cleaner experience, if you let the static sit and dissipate. I don't know why you would do that, but maybe you were thinking, if it's just static that needs to be gone, static will dissipate on its own. It's not just about static like that. It's about negating the static when it's occurring to disallow the aggregation formation. Aggregation formation, that's like a band name. With regard to retention, they actually talk about that briefly in here and prove how sheeting occurs and how the addition of water can and does reduce retention, especially on something like the EK, which can have up to 10%. They noted that it was markedly reducing retention, and that's because it was reducing static at the point of fracture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, students, that was a lot, and I know you're tired, but I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned some things. I hope that you experiment with this and post about it on online forums and share with your friends what you find out for your specific grinder and your roast levels. I'm excited for the continuation of this and how we can implement something like this in a cafe. I'm thinking maybe adding an ionizer or something along those lines to the grind chamber itself so it can do the dirty work while the grinding is going on. I don't know if that would work, it's a hypothesis. But that would be really interesting, is to figure out a way to not need to rely on water in order to do any of this. If there's another way to mitigate the static during grinding without using water, which is potentially corrosive, that would be great. Something that was interesting is they were trying to decide if it was ionic transfer or electron transfer that was going on inside the chamber. So in order to assess this, they used sodium chloride, and if it was ionic transfer, they would have been able to see that very easily with that. But in the end, without going into it too much, you can read it in the paper, they decided it was electron transfer, so cool stuff like that. But I hope that we didn't get too deep into this. I know we went pretty deep, but I really like to find modern science and how it's applying itself to coffee, and I want you to be educated on it because we're in exciting times right now in the coffee world where more and more scientists are taking this extremely complex beverage, this extremely complex agricultural product much more seriously, with people like Hendon and Smirke and Gagne and the like doing some really fun things. And so I want to keep you updated. So I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button on this video, you hit the subscribe, you check out my Standart magazine link in the description below, because all of that really helps the channel and, stokes me to do more stuff like this. I plan on doing more videos on some of the modern science coming out about coffee in the near future, so keep your eyes peeled. Again, show the love if you appreciate things like this. I really do think it's going to help the coffee community, and it's going to help us bring coffee and theory and extraction sciences forward and forward and forward as we march into the future of this complex little thing I like to call coffee. Now, how cheesy was that? Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for making it here. If you made it all the way to the end, tell me the video is Tribo, and I'm going to know that you know that I know that you know that you now know this. So thank you. My voice is gone. Gotta lube up the vocal cords so I can sing. And that's everything for me. So I hope that you brew something tasty today, and cheers.